And our next candidate is the City Council Speaker, Christine Quinn. So I'm going to ask you the thing that I've asked everybody.
Okay.
Should PJ Carlissimo have been fired?
Well, I'm going to give a political answer, but it's not the kind of politics you think. My wife is a Seton Hall Law School grad. She had a full ride to Seton Hall, so if I say anything aside from that, it was a total outrage. She was thrown under the bus, and it's an offense to Seton Hall. Brooklyn aside, I won't be able to go home tonight, so no, he should not have been fired, and Seton Hall should have been given a second opportunity here in Brooklyn.
All right, can I just say you're the first candidate that's answered the question?
Well, because this has been discussed by discussion, I mean mostly me listening to Kim rant about how the injustice to Seton Hall since this has occurred. So I might be better prepared.
From the sublime to the mundane, or maybe not. 4th Avenue was rezoned.
Yes.
4th Avenue zoning 2003. Was that a successful rezoning?
In some ways it was, and in some ways I think it was. Well, let me say it this way. I think the 4th Avenue rezoning was one of the first rezonings that I really remember there being an aggressive conversation about how we could use inclusionary zoning. And although I'm not sure the 4th Avenue rezoning brought everything we wanted to that part of Brooklyn, I would say that in citywide, it pushed that issue forward in a way that I saw the effective ripple effects of in other neighborhoods across the city where we have seen inclusionary zoning be used more aggressively and effectively than it ended up being able to be used there.
So what, because it was raised in that rezoning, it became part of the
more part
package?
Of the kind of tradition. You know, when it was raised there was a lot of like, oh, you can't do that, and that's unusual, and that's not typical, and, you know, no. And then it really, I think, because of the discussions around 4th Avenue, became part of more of a tool in the toolbox that we're using around around zoning and city planning issues now.
The city council member, former city council member Sal Albanese was here earlier. He said that inclusionary zoning needs to be expanded. Instead of 80-20, we should think about 70-30. Should we?
I mean, I think we should, and there are questions about how far we can go with inclusionary zoning, as there was in 4th Avenue, right? And I think we need to find the most aggressive ways we can to use inclusionary zoning. Some have suggested that it become mandatory. I'm not sure that's legal, but it's something I would want to explore the legality of and explore how far we can kind of push the envelope. But within kind of all of these questions are other questions, right? Do we have to accept 80-20? Can we push for 70-30? For me, a big question in all of this is it okay to accept the housing that gets generated in these rezonings be temporarily affordable, right? Whether that's 20 or 30 years. And I think we have to always find ways to be pushing the affordability number, and I think we have to make the goal of permanence paramount. I think that has to become where we end up. Well, there's a number of different ways to do it. So one is in rezonings that I've led both as speaker and as the local council member in Chelsea, where on the west side of Manhattan in my district there's been a rezoning or two, you know what I mean? And even before I was speaker, working with the community boards in my district, we always had the perspective permanence. Even if that meant we might have gotten, you know, I'm kind of making these numbers up, 33% if it was temporary and only 28% if it was permanent, we always went for the permanence. In part, that meant in some of those rezonings, developers having to put in more. In part, it meant the city having to add in subsidies to those. There are different ideas out there we're looking at now of offering property tax cap breaks if people will keep their housing permanently affordable. I will say the real estate industry had an original idea around property tax caps that was extraordinarily generous to them, with both the mayor and I rejected when they tried to get it done in legislation in Albany. But that idea of a cap, if you change the numbers to one where it's really a more break-even, so they're kind of like getting an IRA in part of their housing, not something they would make a ton of money on, is something I think we should explore. The other thing is to look at, right now, there's a proposal for the Housing Authority to take in 8 of the developments, undeveloped property, and make it market rate housing with maybe 20%. And really, it's auctioning it off to the highest bidder. That's a proposal I don't support, in large part because it's not about affordable housing and it's not about permanence. Working with the Tenants Association in my district of the Elliott Chelsea houses, we did take a parking lot there with no land sale cost and developed permanent housing on that site. So you can do things like that, but you can't do it if you're going to sell it to the highest bidder.
And the Barclays Center, the Atlantic Yards project, did not go through the city council. It was a state project.
No. But let me just say, it didn't have to, but it could have.
And had it, how would you have changed it?
And let me just say, and it could, and partially the way it could have is, if you remember, there was a small proposal for a stadium on the west side of Manhattan, which may go down in the history books as one of the worst ideas ever. And I was proud of all of us, and I want to thank folks in this neighborhood who worked with us on the west side of Manhattan in beating that back. The neighborhood opposition facilitated, in part, that proposal having to go through ULURP, even though it didn't have to because it was state land. And the Times Square redevelopment, it wasn't the exact same structure we have now. It was before the charter change. That also went through a full review. So one of the things I would say as mayor moving forward is I would always take the position that land, even if it isn't required to, when there's large developments, maybe not one building here or there, but large developments on public land would have to go through ULURP, because then you can really have a full community conversation with the community board, with their resolutions at the table, and then you can really have different types of projects develop where you might have ended up with a different proposal that might not have had so many folks in opposition. I can't tell you exactly where it would have ended up because I think the project would have looked different had it gone through ULURP, and I wish it had, because we would have had a real neighborhood debate.
So what would you have liked to have seen in it that wasn't? If it had gone through city council, what do you think would be different about this project?
I think you would have seen, well, a lot of the affordable housing and other components that have yet to become realized. I think you would have potentially seen the phase-in differently, that those would have been phased in earlier, and a requirement of a certain level of development around the affordable housing almost to trigger the stadium part of it. I think you would have had clear structures of more community input around the development and around some of the congestion and traffic pieces. I believe we would have had a more robust traffic study and more input for real community input and design around how to deal with the traffic problems.
How do you think that's worked out so far?
So far from what I understand, a lot of the worst fears haven't come to fruition, but I also think it's too early for anyone pro or con to draw a conclusion yet. We haven't kind of even been through a full season, so to speak.
The mayor has taken a position that, I don't know if he said this quite explicitly, but they've introduced a number of pilot
Wait, say that again?
pilot programs to make parking more expensive to discourage, they say, parking and driving in certain areas at certain times.
Oh, okay. When you said pilots, I thought payments in lieu of taxes, because we were talking about development, so I confused myself.
We'll get to that.
I got it. Okay.
But I'm wondering on parking, do you agree with the theory that elevating the price of parking is a good way to reduce driving?
Not necessarily, because I think the truth is that for a lot of New Yorkers, look, some people are just drawn to cars, right? But a lot of people end up in their cars because they don't feel, or they don't actually have, the mass transit options that they need with the flexibility they need to get them where they need to go when they need to get there. That's part of the reason why we've pushed successfully in the council to start more ferry service in the city. The East River ferry service, which is unique in the sense that it doesn't just go on the kind of old spoken wheel model of just the assumption that everybody wants to come back and forth from Manhattan. It moves people within Queens to 2 spots, within Brooklyn and 2 spots, and then to 2 spots in Manhattan. A much more significant recognition that not everybody lives in Manhattan every anymore, and not everyone who's working in Manhattan, and more people are working in the boroughs that they live in. We need to expand more ferry service in a multimodal way to get people out of their cars. I also think we need to add more bus rapid transit or select bus service. I'd like to move forward with 10 more routes across the city. That'll give folks more options that will more than likely help get people out of their cars, particularly during their daily commute.
Enough? 10 more routes?
I think 10 more routes is a good start for bus rapid transit. I think we can go further than that.
But 2 more in each borough?
I think you probably end up with 2 more in each borough. You might end up only with 1 right on the North Shore to start on Staten Island. So it might be 2, 1, and then 1 somewhere else.
Do you feel that for these, true actual BRT, as you know, has physically segregated lanes for buses, no cars at all?
That's right.
Is that something that we should be looking at in New York City?
Absolutely.
So
and it's not going to, we should absolutely be looking at that. That model might not work in every neighborhood, and you're going to want to have community board input on that model. But that is a model that in some places can absolutely work and can really get the buses moving in the way that we want them and we need them to. And again, in addition to the bus service, I really want to move to more of a 5-borough ferry service. You know, the East River Ferry in its first 6 months exceeded our year-long goals for the first year. The first mass transit back online after Sandy, the East River Ferry. We need to keep the ferry that's been put in place as an emergency in Rockaway. We need to keep that going, and we need to expand that ferry service in other places in the city.
Just sticking with the buses for a minute, because, as you know, road space is very deeply contested. So turning over a lane to a bus means no automobile traffic in that lane. That is likely to upset some people. As mayor, would you be willing to take the heat thrown off by that?
Well, I've already said I was willing to explore that, so I guess such is life. But look, that's not necessarily going to work on every block in every neighborhood. And again, you want to have community board input, but there are places where that will absolutely work and really be the thing that brings us real bus rapid transit in this city.
What about bike lanes? Was the Prospect Park bike lane a good idea? Would you have pushed for it if you were mayor?
Bike lanes overall, I think the expansion of bike lanes in the city has been a positive thing. Now, those communities that say it didn't happen with enough community input at points in the process were right, because unlike what I just said about BRT or unlike sidewalk cafes, the Department of Transportation wasn't required to go to community boards for input. We passed a law. They now are. I think that makes the siting of bike lanes better, a more participatory process. It's not going to make everybody happy, but it is going to make sure everybody has input. And we've seen in some places, like in Brooklyn and Councilmember Fidler's district, where there was real opposition over a bike lane, the community board process moved where it was, and it's been a big success in that case. So I think we want to keep bike lanes growing, so to speak, and expanding, but you want to do that with community board input.
In this case, how would you have done the process differently?
I think in the parks, the one by the park, I think you would have had as much community board input as you possibly can. It was clear that there were 2 sides in the neighborhood that felt very strongly. Not every process, even if it is fully participatory, is going to make everybody happy, but I really do think you want to honor the community board's voice and make sure it's heard.
Well, in this case, they voted for it.
Right, which is one of the things that I think is important in a process, to make sure that voice is very much at the table and heard.
Mayor said his bike share system wants it to be 10,000 bikes. If you were elected mayor and it wasn't 10,000 bikes, would you meet that goal?
If it wasn't 10,000 bikes?
Would you honor that commitment? That's the plan. It's obviously was delayed because of Sandy and some other reasons. So if they don't get them all in by the end of 2013 and you were elected, would you continue along that plan, or would you?
Assuming that we don't see data that shows it's not working, right? At that point in the process, we'll have some level of data the first roll out or pedal out or whatever the right way to describe it is. But assuming the data concurs with what we believe, yeah, we would keep it moving forward. But then we'll have some data to look at.
Is it something that you would want to expand further?
I don't know. We're going to have to look at the data and see whether it's successful, whether it's working. There's obviously been some concerns raised about the siting of the slots or spots. The docks, right, the docks.
Have you ever ridden a bike share in any other city?
Pardon me?
Have you ever ridden a bike share in any other city?
I have not ridden a bike share in other cities, but I'm not that coordinated, quite frankly. So it's not a philosophical statement about bikes. It is a very specific statement about my coordination.
That hard to ride. So.
You know, I do spinning. The bikes are locked in. Trust me. I had training wheels for a very long time. So.
Councilmember Brad Lander was here during a little intermission.
And I think I've seen Councilmember Steve Levin walk in, so I want to recognize Steve for being here too.
So, and he said that he thought that the most important Bloomberg initiative was his Livable Streets initiative. What do you think about that? And is that something you'd continue?
I think, I don't know if I would say it's his most important, but I would agree with Brad. I think that has been a very important initiative. You know, you hear a lot across the city for a long time about just how nervous pedestrians were, particularly seniors. You know, one of the things we launched in the city council, and then the mayor's office came along and became a part of it too, which was great, but with the New York Academy of Medicine, actually led by a Park Slope resident, we set off on an effort to make New York City a World Health Organization age-friendly city. And we did town hall meetings all across the city with seniors. And one of the main things they talked to us about was their fear out there on the streets of cars and of walking. And I think the steps that have been taken, the ones the mayor's associated with, the things like the countdown clocks are really making streets safer. And that's going to be a critical part of making sure that all New Yorkers, but particularly older and younger New Yorkers, feel safe walking around. And one of the things that leads a lot of actually folks to now want to retire in New York is they know they don't have to drive and they don't have to worry about that.
There's been some talk about zoning more of Brooklyn or pieces of Brooklyn for industrial uses. Is that something that you would support, and if so, where? You know, I really like the idea of finding ways to expand our kind of industrial and manufacturing potential. And you know, it's important to note, and I don't think we get enough credit for this, quite frankly, in the city, that the Brooklyn Navy Yard, we grew manufacturing jobs there during the recession. There's probably no other place or very few other places that can say they did that. And you know, we have great potential right now in Sunset Park to take the management structure that we have at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and one of the things that's key there is they don't make payments to the Economic Development Corporation like they do at some of the other similar yards or terminals in the city. That money just keeps circulating through the Navy Yard. If we did that in Sunset Park at the Marine Terminal or the Bush Terminal, I think we could grow in probably a year's time, 2,000 more manufacturing jobs there. We in the council, and we started with Evidco in Brooklyn, put a small manufacturing fund in place, about $10 million in the capital budget. And we've taken, working with Evidco and others, taken those factories and subdivided them. Buildings that otherwise might get torn down or seen kind of as useless. I visited one. It was an old rope factory. It was huge because they needed a place for the horse to turn around and not the rope. We don't really need that anymore. It's now been subdivided. The first floor is 150 people making molding for high-end apartments. There was 6 people making stained glass windows, about 20 people making Bakelite jewelry. We have the potential to harness parts of our city, Brooklyn and others, and we'd need to have conversations with the community board and city planning about where to take our old factories and subdivide them like that. I know I'm in Brooklyn, but in the Bronx, we have potential with the same kind of factories and all of the roads and highways there, I think, to turn them into places that can do the greening that we want to do and are required to do around the trucking fleet and make New York and the South Bronx a real hub for that kind of work. The mayor has... But also, I'm sorry, we need to not just think of places where we can do that in the sense of changing the zoning. We need to be careful as zoning ideas come in that we don't say, oh, well, there isn't any manufacturing there. There isn't any industrial there. We can just get rid of it. We need to first ask ourselves, it may not be here now, but can we bring it back? Because that's easier than starting over, in addition to the question you asked. Sorry. The mayor's had a very data-driven school system, and there's been a lot of talk tonight about using testing less aggressively as an evaluation tool. Do you agree with that? I do agree with that. You know, look,
we have testing requirements now, right? And some of those federal standards, state standards, et cetera, aren't going away. But I don't think we need to do as much more of that than we are doing now. You know, one thing I've talked a lot about, and really I heard this most strongly from a meeting with parents that I had actually in Carroll Gardens, about field testing and how so many people's children, and in some schools it's worse than others, are taken kind of out of the classroom, not being taught whatever that day's lesson is, but instead are taking tests. Those tests are not even being counted. They don't go towards any of the requirement. Field tests are your children practicing, mapping out, being kind of guinea pigs for Pearsons and others on what next year's questions are going to be. And some schools are targeted to be field testing schools, so those children lose even more time in the classroom. We're paying Pearson and these testing companies more than enough money. They can find their own way to develop next year's questions, not have our children lose critical classroom time helping them do that. So that's one way we can immediately reduce testing. Two, I'm a huge advocate of what's called portfolio assessment. And we have schools, here, we have a little enthusiasm for portfolio assessment in the third row, thank you. We have some schools in the city that are being judged on a portfolio concept, on more than just testing. If you look at those portfolio assessment schools, they're some of the best ones we have in the city. There is no evidence that they are schools that somehow we're letting off the hook or letting them get away easy. Those children are doing extraordinarily well. We need to expand the potential of more schools to become part of portfolio testing. And I just want to add, this is a little tangential, but related. You know, right now, the Bronx Sciences and the Stuyvesant Town, Brooklyn Techs, et cetera, the specialty high schools, or whatever the right way to describe them is, they're all based on one test. As I understand it, we are the only, or one of the few cities, but I think we are the only city in the country that still has that standard of only one test. There's actually an NAACP lawsuit right now to change that. I've said, and I just want to repeat it, we need to change that system. We can't have just one test lead to be the only reason that determines what children are going to go to those schools. And that's part of the reason why we're seeing those schools be both racially but gender-wise also very lacking in diversity.
So does the whole school selection process need to be reformed?
I'm sorry, I didn't get your question.
Does the whole school selection process for middle school and high school, should it be reformed?
I think you want to be looking, certainly in the specialized schools, I think in areas in gifted and talented, there's changes that we can make. I think the middle school process seems to me to be one of the most stressful procedures that any parent has to go to, and it seems very confused and unclear and lacking in just consistency. So I think overall we need to find ways to make it just a less challenging process for families.
There's been news bubbling up of late about you. Criticism from
oh no,
Democratic
there has been
Party
none. It's been
saying, and I think they fall into two main camps, maybe three, but two that I can think of is that one is that you're too mean, and the other is that you're too close to business interests and you're not progressive enough. So here you are in the area formerly known as the People's Republic of Park Slope. I'm not sure if it still is, but how do you address those two things? You know,
I'm tough, and I'm pushy, and I'm loud. And I was pretty much, thank you very much, the man in the front row said that's for sure. And you know, I was pretty much born that way. I have one sister, she's 10 years older, and she says the day they brought me home from the hospital, she thought my hand was gonna pop out of the, you know, the little blanket and introduce myself and shake her hand. You know, it's who I am. And I don't think I'm mean, but I do think I'm tough. And I'm happy about that. Because I have a job where New Yorkers need me as speaker and, God willing, as mayor to deliver. And if your job is to deliver for New Yorkers every day, your job is to try to pass laws and budgets and priorities that make people's lives better, well, you better be willing to push. You better be willing to fight as hard as New Yorkers do every day for themselves and their families. You need to be prepared to fight that hard. That's what I've done in every job I've ever had, as a housing organizer, as a crime victims advocate, as a speaker, and as a mayor. And I'm never going to let up that push for New Yorkers if I'm in a position to try to make their lives better. I just think it's too important, our work. Now look, we have to work with everybody. We have to work with community boards. We have to work with business leaders. We have to work with activists and academics. We have to seize the potential of our city in every way that it's a capital, right? A financial capital, a design capital, soon to be the tech capital of the country. We have to seize all of those people and entities that are part of those capitals to make our city the other capitals we want us to be. You know, I want us to be the literacy capital of America, the city that has the best reading rate, the schools that have the best scores. We can use these other entities in our city to help us get to that level of success. I want us not just to be the high-tech capital of America. I want us to be the tech capital of America that has the most graduates of CUNY working in tech centers. We've put a program in place to put CUNY grads into high-tech companies in New York. We'll graduate the first class this year. That's what you can do when you seize all of our potential and say everybody's voice needs to be heard, as long as we're all working to move our city forward as a place of opportunity.
So that's the answer to the "you're not progressive enough, too close to business interests" question.
It's about getting things done. Look, I'm incredibly proud of our record in the city council, a record of having prevented the layoff of 4,100 school teachers, a record of having passed more pro-tenant laws than any city council in history. If you're a tenant now and you're being harassed by your landlord, you can take your landlord to court for the first time in this city's history, because of a law we passed in the city council. If you're a woman trying to go to a reproductive health center, there's a really tough clinic defense law on the books because of the city council. And you can no longer walk into a place and allow them to pretend to be a reproductive health center when they're not, because they're hiding behind the name Crisis Pregnancy Center. We stopped that. And look, that law is progressive enough that we're being sued by a so-called Right to Life organization right now. And I'm also incredibly proud of our green accomplishments that I believe really are progressive. We passed laws, a law around the carbon footprint of the city of New York, that when we finish implementing it, will have reduced New York City's carbon footprint by the equivalent of the entire carbon footprint of the city of Oakland, California. That's progressive, and it's delivering, and it's going to make the future of our city better, and I'm incredibly proud of that.
So you raised the issue of carbon footprints. The issue of climate change has come up a couple times tonight. To what extent do you think hardening the city, protecting its infrastructure against climate change is going to be a central issue for the next mayor?
I think all of the issues that were raised by Sandy, in their totality, are the most important infrastructure issues of our time. And at the top of the list, you're right, is hardening the exterior of New York City. And no pun on the meaner question earlier on, but this is something that needs to move beyond an academic discussion. We need to commit to a plan. Some of the barriers will be man-made, and I'm very grateful to Chuck Schumer, who's working with us to get the first Army Corps of Engineers study we need done to move that forward. Stamford, Connecticut did that in the 60s after they were walloped by a storm. It was critical.
You're talking about seawalls.
Yes, critical to protecting them against Sandy. Now, most of the barriers will not end up being man-made. There's going to have to be a comprehensive network, some man-made, some natural. Oyster bedding, blue belts. There's a neighborhood in Staten Island, for example, that does not want to rebuild. The Governor Cuomo is right to buy those residents out, make that part of an expanded blue belt in Staten Island. But we need to commit to that comprehensive barrier network for the city. We also need to recognize all of the other systems that didn't work during Sandy and figure out how to make them work and add in redundancy. You know, only 15% of New Yorkers get their power from overhead lines, but 50% of the New Yorkers who were without power during Sandy were people who got them from overhead power lines. Manhattan, all the power lines are underground. We need to begin to moving the overhead power lines in the city underground. And we passed a law in the city council to start that planning process moving forward in a prioritized way. We also need to add redundancy into our gas system. I think for folks who weren't in Zone A, that was kind of the most psychologically jarring part of Sandy was the gas shortage. Now, some gas stations had gas but didn't have power. We need to create a network of generators out there in gas stations so we can make sure we have power. Two, we need to recognize that the big oil companies like Mobil and Exxon were bad players during Sandy. Hess and the regional gas companies, they gave gas to any gas station that had power, even if they weren't a Hess gas station. We need federal legislation that requires gas companies in a time of natural disaster to put gas wherever there is the power to pump it. And the Building Resiliency Committee, which the mayor and I had re-impaneled, is reporting back soon, and we're going to need neighborhood conversations on this. And they will answer the question now, post-Sandy, where can we build? Where can't we build? What do we have to build with, and how do we build? You know, the assumption that your boiler and your electrical panel will always be in the basement of your building, that's probably just not going to be the truth anymore. Some buildings will need to be elevated. In Seagate, not so far from here, where there was a cement seawall, it was gone. Where there was a reinforced steel seawall, it was still there the days after Sandy, and the houses on either side, well, you can imagine which ones did better.
Getting a stop sign here.
Oh, I'm
I just
sorry.
wanted to ask you.
Oh, sorry.
In 140 characters or less.
Oh, God.
What would be said about you at the end of 8 years as mayor? Chris Quinn. Or it doesn't have to be 140 characters.
Well, you know,
but it could be terse.
this won't be terse, but I don't know if any of you saw when Bruce Springsteen was installed in the Kennedy Center's honors, and I think it was Jon Stewart who inducted him. And he said the great thing about a Bruce Springsteen concert is at the end of every concert, Bruce has emptied his tank. There is nothing left. And I hope at the end of 8 years, people will say something like that I emptied my tank, that I gave it all. There was nothing more I could have done, that I gave everything I possibly could.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bill, come on up. It's the end of the evening, so. So the question that I have now asked all, I think, 7 of you tonight, should P.J. Carlesimo have been fired?
It was an act of injustice. You don't get to the playoffs and get fired immediately. That's not cool.
All right, there you go. That's two responses on the P.J. Carlesimo question. Barclays Center, yes. Has it been a good thing for Brooklyn?
It's been a good thing for Brooklyn, but it's not why that development at Atlantic Yards was worth it. That will only be true when the affordable housing is built, and it's something I'm committed to following through. Just a quick and simple answer. I thought that, and I think saying that Atlantic Yards was controversial is a great understatement of our times.
You think?
Yeah, I think just a little. But what I felt is, in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, the possibility of creating a really extraordinary amount of affordable housing and an extraordinary number of jobs, union-scale jobs for folks in surrounding neighborhoods, many of which were disadvantaged, that was the worthy goal. Government, I don't think, has done a real good job of following through on that goal, and I think the next mayor has to do that very aggressively.
Was the deal structured in a way that developers could be held accountable?
The community benefits agreement was stronger, both in terms of the amount asked of the developer, proportionate to other similar agreements around the city. It was one of the strongest we've ever seen. I think it would have been much stronger had there been a direct government participation in the guarantee process. I think that was a structural flaw. But I think it's now the role of government to step in and do it.
So what can government do?
I think the fact is that the current developer can, and like every other developer, which they endlessly want other opportunities from government, other permissions, if you will, other approvals on a host of projects. I think there can be a very noble and appropriate linkage that says if you want to continue to do business, you have to keep your previous commitments. If you can't keep your previous commitments, let's find someone else who can.
Now, that, when the building is built out, that census tract, as you know, will be the densest in the nation. Yeah. Is there the appropriate infrastructure there to support that?
Look, I think the original environmental impact statement was lacking. I didn't like that process. I mean, I think there's a lot of things along the way that could have been done better, but I think we can catch up on the infrastructure because, let's face it, the build-out will be 10 to 15 years minimum.
What can be done? And if you were mayor, what would you do to ensure that there would be the appropriate sewage and the right number of schools and even transit?
Well, the transit options, obviously the underground transit options are exceptional. And that's one of the great strengths of the sites, one of the great transit sites in the whole country, in fact. I think the bigger issues are around, sewer and water and other types of infrastructure. And again, I think if we objectively look at the needs and we find we have to do some build-outs, there is time to do it, and it's a worthy public investment considering the amount of housing that will be created in a city that we all know is pushing on towards 9 million people. But I'm most concerned about the affordable housing. Look, I think the central challenge right now in this city is that we have an affordability crisis and we have an income disparity crisis. And I think I can say safely, particularly folks in this room, all the organizations represented here, and your commitment to a diverse, inclusive New York City, we don't want to see New York City be unavailable for the rich mix of people that have been its historic reality. If we're going to keep up, if we're going to have a city that's really economically diverse, we have to constantly build more affordable housing. And I've put out a plan recently that I think can do that at a much bigger level. But this project has to be fully realized because we simply need the housing and particularly the high percentage of affordability. We have to put the investment into infrastructure to catch up with that need. That's the reality.
The rezoning of 4th Avenue in 2003 was rezoning that I think all of you running for mayor who were in the city council at the time supported. But it has not thrown off a lot of affordable housing. No. It has resulted in a lot of school overcrowding. Was it a good idea? Was it a mistake in retrospect? It
was a mistake to not include, to not have an inclusionary zoning component. Look, at the time, you'll remember, and I was relatively new in the council, but I remember it very vividly. You had a great opportunity to downzone neighborhoods and areas of neighborhoods that deserved it and needed it. You also had an opportunity in the upzoning of 4th Avenue to put real requirements on in terms of affordable housing. Now, this was early in the Bloomberg years, too, and there was a tremendous unwillingness to put those requirements in place. So, I think we lost hundreds of potential affordable units on 4th Avenue, some of which we might be able to regain, but a lot of which we won't. That's why, as part of my affordable housing plan, I've put in a plank that says mandatory inclusionary zoning. Literally, you require upfront for large-scale development a substantial amount of affordability, essentially as the price of admission for developers. Well,
Sal Albanese said tonight that he thought the inclusionary zoning formula should be 70-30. Do you agree with that formula?
I'm starting with the notion of 80-20, but I think the goal is to try and move it upward case by case. I don't know if we can do 70-30 in every case given the economics of different projects. And I also think there are other community benefits we want in some projects. One, I was involved in the Upper West Side of Manhattan recently. The most pertinent community need was space for school building in the development. So sometimes there will be other needs that you've got to balance with the affordable housing.
Is that something that...
Just one more, I'm sorry, real quick. But I do know you can't have large-scale development without an affordable housing component anymore. We just can't afford that given the affordable housing needs of the city. And 4th Avenue is a poster child for that. I think Greenpoint Williamsburg is a poster child for that in the sense of very loose commitments on affordable housing that were never followed through on. That kind of habit just can't continue in this city.
Is requiring school construction something that should be a part of every rezoning?
Well, not every, but I think the reality is there's some parts of the city that have seen a boom in public school attendance that are truly, under-resourced in terms of public school seats, and the development process is one of the ways to address it. I don't think that's true in every neighborhood. But I'd say with any community benefits package, I think affordable housing is the one given. Almost every community wants that to be a part of a community benefits plan around any development. I think in some cases there are open space needs that are particularly profound. In some cases, again, there might be a public school need. But I think the kind of consistency is affordable housing, and you try and maximize it in every case, but you might do less proportionally if there were one of those other needs that was particularly profound.
The mayor has made a big commitment to affordable housing, 165,000 units. Has he done a bad job on that?
No, he's not done a bad job, but wait a minute. I'm too close? Wow, I'm sorry. Don't lean. It's that good? Yes. All right, I'm trying it again. Can you hear me out there? Yes. Wow, this new modern technology. The 165,000 over 12 years is an accomplishment, but offset by several realities. One, we lost almost as much affordable housing. Units that left the Mitchell-Lama program, units that left rent regulation. Two, the distribution of the housing in the mayor's plan, disproportionately towards Manhattan, disproportionately towards the upper side of the income levels within affordability. Smaller apartments, relatively speaking, compared to need across the city. So I want a recasting of the priorities within the affordable housing plan. But what I've put forward in my plan is 200,000 over 10 years between new and preserved units. It takes the similar approach to the mayor to achieve over half of that, and would continue the capital funding requirements to do that. But then I add on mandatory inclusionary zoning, which is particularly pertinent in a very strong real estate market, which we're back in again. The investment of at least $1 billion of our pension fund dollars into affordable housing creation, which has worked in many parts of the country but has been wildly underutilized in New York City. And here's my personal favorite, we've all driven around our city or walked around our city and seen vacant plots of land that we just can't figure out why they're vacant year in and year out. Well, one of the reasons is a tax code that actually incentivizes landowners to keep their land off the market and do very well in tax terms in the meantime. I want to reverse that and incentivize the development of land, particularly, of course, for affordable housing. But we need a lot of market rate housing, too. But what I hate is the notion of land not being used when we need housing, and in fact, public dollars helping that land not being used, and that's the reality right now.
Let's talk about education for a
Please.
moment. Do you think that the selection process for middle school and high school should be changed?
I think it needs to be simplified over time. I went through it now twice with my son and daughter for both middle school and high school, and look, I think parents legitimately feel, one, that it's more complicated than it has to be, two, that there's not enough sense of guarantee. There's too many times when parents get none of their top 12 choices, and it's kind of mystical as to how that could possibly happen. So I think there needs to be an ongoing effort to simplify, to educate, to ensure that those top choices mean something and have a definite consequence. I do defend one thing, which is I think we have more and more great choices around this city, and that's something that's different than 20 or 30 years ago. But I think a much simpler process. I particularly think on the front end of it, even before middle school and high school, the fact that parents are so extraordinarily stressed over pre-K applications. First of all, something's wrong with that right there. But that's why I proposed a controversial, but I think necessary and important plan to tax the wealthiest New Yorkers so we can have full-day universal pre-K for every child who needs it in this city.
District 2 in Manhattan is putting priority on its students for certain high school choices. Is that fair?
Well, I don't know if it's unfair. I mean, it seems to me you've got so many different configurations out there. I mean, I can tell you what I know is unfair. The way we go about the testing for the specialized schools is patently unfair from my point of view. You can't have so many children's futures determined by a single standardized test. And you can't have schools like Stuyvesant, most notoriously, that so fundamentally misrepresent the population of this city. So I want a profound reform in that. But I don't have a problem with some, district preferences, given the sheer number of options that are out there in this city now.
This neighborhood, the neighborhood where you and I live in, has doubled in value in the last 12 years. Is that a good thing or is it a bad thing?
It's a good thing that people who have worked their lives to, own a home find that value to be strong. It's a good thing, what it's meant for, revenue for the city and what it's allowed the city to do in terms of providing services to everyone. It's a really challenging thing, and like everything with gentrification, it's a challenging thing because it makes it hard to maintain economic diversity. And I think we have to be very clear, if we want an economically diverse city, one, we're going to have to really fundamentally change our approach to affordable housing so we're producing a much greater and preserving a much greater supply of affordable housing. But two, we have to use a host of economic tools to create opportunity. I always say it's a local version of Keynesianism. It's obviously a local government can only do so much, but this local government is so huge and has such powerful tools. Our pension fund dollars, again, can help us create jobs and affordable housing. We have policy tools like living wage legislation and paid sick days that can make a profound positive effect in family economies so people can still afford to live here. We have policies like how we treat small businesses, which I think we're doing wrong right now, that inhibit job creation, that we can change to encourage job creation. We have extraordinary tools. If you apply all those tools, you can balance some of the effects of high property values and of gentrification. If you don't, it becomes a much more exclusive and unaffordable city. And that is my respectful critique of the third Bloomberg term, that there was not a larger addressing of the crisis of affordability and the crisis of income disparity in this city, and we're not even using the tools that we have available to us to address those pressing problems.
Mayor would say that was not a possibility during the post-recession era.
But again, look at the tools that I just described. Investing our pension fund dollars, that was absolutely a possibility in the post-2008 dynamics because the market tanked, so putting our pension funds into traditional investments was not a good use of our money. We could have been using pension funds years ago to create affordable housing and create jobs in this city. That was, in my view, the mayor's free marketeer bias standing in the way of that. We could have taken action on paid sick days 3 years ago, but Bloomberg opposed it and Quinn wouldn't bring it to a vote. But if we had done it 3 years ago, do you know how many people would have been able to save their jobs, not lose their jobs because they were sick? Do you know how many people would have been able to save weeks of pay that they lost because they were sick, and what that meant to their household economies? There were tools that we could have used before, and we didn't, and now we have to.
Let's talk just for a minute or so about public transportation in Brooklyn. What do you think the borough's greatest transit needs are?
I think farther out. I mean, our communities, I live in walking distance from here, and I love this community, but I think the greatest needs are farther out. I think there's areas like Canarsie that don't have subway service and have much too limited bus service. And I think that's still the fundamental conundrum in mass transit in this city, that it's not truly representative. There are parts, the outer parts of each of the outer boroughs still struggling to be fully accessible, and that's one of the missions of our times, to make the MTA address those needs more fundamentally.
How?
Look, this is the problem of the MTA. I mean, right now, the first thing we have to do with the MTA is protect the payroll tax, which is under tremendous attack in Albany, particularly from suburban interests. And I always forgive my chauvinism, but I always find that a little ridiculous because the suburban interests do very well, having their reality surround the thriving dynamics of New York City. But we're going to have to defend the payroll tax. Over time, I think it's about simply trying, as we gain, hopefully, more resources and a better economy, to make sure that the most underserved areas get helped first. And I think first and foremost, that's those farther out parts of the outer boroughs.
The bike lane a block from here. If you were mayor, would you have installed it?
Well, I was dubious of it in the beginning. I want to be very straightforward. I live in this community. I have for 20 years. I was not part of the community board process, so I literally started experiencing it for the first time without a whole lot of notice, and I found it a little perplexing because it was two-way and one thing or another. But I think in practice it has worked in the end. I think it's worked. I think it's better than bikes being on the sidewalk. I think that expanding bike use is ultimately the right way to go for this city. So I think what was not done right was a deeper kind of consultation, not just community board, but a deeper consultation with community residents to figure out what would work and what wouldn't. I think this has been an endemic problem with the Bloomberg approach to bike lanes. Some of them have worked beautifully. There are still plenty of areas in this city where we could apply new bike lanes well. But others were put in without an actual consultative process with neighbors and with small businesses in particular, and then had to be fundamentally modified after being in practice for a while or being in use for a while. I have a somewhat radical notion in the Bloomberg era that government, as difficult and complicated a place as this is, government has a profound obligation to consult with stakeholders. Community boards are important, but they're one piece of the puzzle. We now have, certainly technologically, the ability to reach out to a whole swath of the citizenry of any neighborhood and get feedback and help them understand what we're trying to do and see what works and what doesn't. So that's the approach I would like to take. By the way, the approach I'd like to take with the way parents are treated by the DOE, which right now is wildly unconsultative. I think we've gone astray because this mayor in particular did not value citizen input and didn't treat citizens as stakeholders. He didn't conceptualize that citizens were stakeholders. That's why you can have everything from schools opening and closing without parents to, stop and frisk being overused in a community. It all fits one line of treating people as if they don't have any meaningful input in the process. We can change that. I'm convinced we can.
All right. Is there a time, though? I mean, people in general don't like things that disrupt their personal geography, whether it's a bike lane or bus lane or even sometimes a plaza where there wasn't one before. As mayor, sometimes you just have to sort of push them forward, or is your view never do it if people in the actual community around it don't want it?
I think it's you one have an obligation to consult. And I'll use examples from this community. When I supported a lot of affordable housing development along the Gowanus Canal, a lot of people in the community didn't agree. Now, I said, look, I ran on a platform of affordable housing creation, and I'm desperately concerned that gentrification is reshaping the neighborhood sort of to be something different than what people expected to be, an exclusive place and not an economically inclusive place, and the only way to address it is with affordable housing creation. I tried to put that on the table as my set of values that I would fight for. People had a whole range of opinions, a lot of concern, a lot of opposition. I had to work with that. I had to hear it out. I had to see if there was some kind of balance point. It didn't change me from trying to fight for what I believed in, but a lot of times what you find is some kind of balance, some kind of modification occurs. Let me use the example of a school co-location because I think it's such an obvious one. Some school co-locations were never meant to be. They're a bad idea, and if there's an actual consultative process, it would point out that they're a bad and unworkable idea. Other school locations, co-locations can work if major changes are made to respond to the needs of the receiving school. But that can only work in that give and take. So I don't see a contradiction between a leader saying, here's where I think we need to go, listening to people, see what works and what doesn't work, being able to say, as the person I idolized in the mayoralty, LaGuardia, was famous for being able to say when he was wrong, sometimes you're going to be wrong, but that doesn't mean you don't have a clear vision of where you're trying to go.
All right, and I think that sounds like a great place to wind up this evening. Thanks so much, Bill de Blasio.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to say thank you on behalf of all the civic groups, and thank you so much to the audience for sitting so patiently and being such a great and engaged audience.
Thank you, everyone. Lightning round.